most popular questions that I'm being asked at the moment is about how much starter do I need? And if I feed my starter, how do I have enough to be able to bake my bread? And if I'm doing a maintenance feed, how do I make it bigger? And if I'm making bread, how do I stop wasting it on the days that I'm not baking? There are so many questions and I totally understand it. And it's kind of three things to think about. The first one is actually making your starter. So the very first time that your starter becomes active, that is classed as making your starter. And that can take anywhere from 1 to 2, 3, even 4 weeks to get your starter going. And that is making your starter. And that's when you are feeding it and discarding it and throwing all of that discard in the bin, because your starter isn't activated then, so you can't really be using it for any discard recipes, and it can feel quite frustrating. So during that time of making your starter, that is the time that you want to keep it as small as possible. So you wouldn't be looking at recipes or anything at that time, which is why I recommend doing a 50 gram 50 grams of water, 50 grams of starter and 50 grams of flour, just because it gives you enough to see when it's visually doubled in size, enough to be able to see whether or not it's becoming active, but not so much that you're then wasting your flour. Because if you did that over 1 week, you'd be looking at discarding sort of like 300 to 400 grams of starter. Over a fortnight, 600 to 700 grams. That's only half a bag of flour. And then once you've got your active starter, you've then got that for life, and then you maintain that. So that's the first thing about starters and how you feed it. The second thing is maintenance. So a starter needs to be fed every single day to keep it active, whether you're baking or not. So you've kind of got two options with regards to the maintenance. You either keep it in the fridge and then it remains dormant during that time, which is where I keep my discard. So in theory, discard is just unfed starter. So that gets kept in the fridge, but to have a lovely, strong, healthy, really active starter, it is better to keep it out of the fridge and feed it every single day. Now, lots of people would say, I can't do that because it's too wasteful. But you can actually feed your starter with 1 gram. You could feed 1 gram of starter, 1 gram of flour and 1 gram of water, which would then give you 3 grams. Then the next day you would discard 2 grams. You'd still have your 1, you'd feed it with 1 and feed it with 1. If you want to do minute amounts, you absolutely can. You could do 10 grams, 20 grams, 100 grams. But just remember that if you don't feed at a minimum of a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1, then your starter can quite quickly become acidic, it won't double in size, and it won't be strong enough for baking sourdough. So it's up to you when it comes to your maintenance feeding, how much you choose to feed it basically. I go with 50 grams just because it's a nice easy number. But you can also then take that and do a higher ratio. So if you had 1 gram and you did a 1 to 3 to 3 ratio, you'd have 1 gram of starter, 3 grams of flour and 3 grams of water. Then the next day you'd discard all of that, back down to 1 gram, 3 grams of flour and 3 grams of water. So it's entirely up to you as to how much you decide to do that. But of course, once you have activated your starter after a couple of weeks of making the starter, you can then keep it in your discard jar and then use it for other recipes such as cookies or sandwich bread or Yorkshire puddings or pancakes or waffles, or basically anything that has flour in it. You can substitute some of that with your discard, looking at different recipes and stuff. So that's the first 2 things that you need to think about when feeding your starter. And then the third thing is about baking. So of course, if you have only 10 grams of starter, that is not enough to bake. It's fantastic for your maintenance days because you're not discarding and sort of wasting flour. But then of course the next day you're like, I want to bake. So you take that 10 grams and then you work out how much starter you need for your recipe, how much you want to be left over to maintain, and then you go from there. So if I had 10 grams of starter and I wanted to bake, and my recipe calls for 150 grams of starter to go in, I then want to put in 75 grams of flour, 75 grams of water, which is my 150, and then I'm left with 10 grams. And yes, that's a ratio of 1 to 7.5 to 7.5, but that's okay, because if you use a higher ratio, you can find that it actually strengthens your starter. The only thing that you will find when you use a higher ratio, that whilst it can strengthen your starter, it can take longer. Now that can go in your benefit. So let's say you wanted to make your dough first thing in the morning. You either have to set your alarm clock for say 3 a.m. to do a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio to have your starter ready for 7 a.m. to have it done in a 4-hour period. And if you want to set your alarm clock for 3 a.m. to make dough at 7, you do you, that's fine. But actually, the higher the ratio of feeding, the longer it takes to reach peak. So not only do you then get a slightly stronger starter from doing a higher ratio, it might actually suit your feeding schedule. So if you fed your starter at 8 or 9 o'clock at night and you fed it at a 1 to 7.5 to 7.5 ratio, and then the next morning at, let's say, 7 a.m, your starter has now doubled in size because it's taken, 12 hours or whatever time it is that you want that's going to work for your life, then that's absolutely fantastic, because it could be that you feed your starter in the morning, go to work all day, come home, make your dough, do all of the stretch and folds and stuff like that, and then your bulk fermentation, if you get the temperature right, you could do that overnight, put it cold proofed in the fridge whilst you're at work all day, and then when you come home from work, pop it in the oven and you've got fresh bread for dinner. Now, it's all about when do you want your fresh bread, to kind of work backwards from that. So I hope that makes sense. You've got 3 options when it comes to feeding. The first one is making your starter from scratch. So that will be very different to any other type of feeding. Your second one is a maintenance feed to keep your starter active, to keep it going, to keep it strong. And then your third one is feeding to bake. So how much do you want to bake? Because of course, if I wanted to bake 2 loaves, I then need 300 grams of starter. So then I'd need to add 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water. And there are other people out there that are baking 50 loaves. So they need a lot more starter. So they will work out what their baking schedule looks like, and they will work out how long it takes. And then they might want to think about how to warm it up, because even if you have done a higher ratio, you still might want it done in a quicker time. That's where heat mats, these proving boxes that you can get, provers within air fryers and ovens. It could be that you put it near a radiator. It could be all sorts of things. And that's where you have to learn what it is that you want, because there is no definitive answer into how to feed your starter, how much to feed your starter, and which recipe that you want to follow. I hope that makes sense, because it sounds like it's very complicated, but it isn't when you think about what it is that I want. So if you have got any questions, do ask them. I'll see what I can do to help you. Don't forget to give me a follow and stick around for more sourdough content.